Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Jim Franklin from the Department of Politics and Government, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Benjamin F. Marsh Lecture Series on Public Affairs. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd talk a little bit about Ben Marsh, who made this series possible. Ben Marsh graduated from Ohio Wesleyan in 1950. This was during the long career of Professor Ben Arneson. Students here might have heard of the Arneson Institute. It was named after him. Ben Arneson encouraged students to sign a pledge to engage in public affairs. Ben Marsh signed this pledge, and he certainly made good on his promise, serving in a number of important positions at the city, county, federal levels throughout his life. These included president of the Ohio Municipal League, election supervisor in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a representative of the U.S. to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO. Ben endowed this lectureship in 1999, and through his generosity, we've been able to sponsor over 20 lectures by some of the most prominent scholars and leaders in the country. Ben regularly took part in these lectures until he passed away in 2014. Other members of the Marsh family have been taking part in the series since then. And tonight, I want to welcome Libby Marsh and her husband, John Casanova, who are there in the back. We're really happy to have you here. I want to express our gratitude to the Marsh family. This lecture series continues to be a gift to the whole community and a great legacy for Ben. So thank you for that. Given Ben's emphasis on participation and citizenship, I want to recognize that OWU student voter registration increased to 86.6% of OWU students were registered to vote in 2020. And over 81% of those students voted. The report is just out, and OWU is actually above the national average now. And so I want to thank Professor Francesca Nestor, Professor Brianna Mack, who's now running these efforts, and also Mallory Watts, who also played a role in 2020. And I'd like to invite Professor Mack to come up and talk a little bit about our registration efforts right now.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, I am Professor Mack. I teach classes on American political behavior, so courses on public opinion, media and politics, race and ethnicity, and of course, voters and elections, which leads into my whole spiel, right? So, right now we have 77 applications. So these includes folks who are first-time registers, updating their addresses, and requests for absentee ballots. But you've heard, like 2020 for 80%. I would love to see that number again for 2022. However, that number depends on you all you students over there. I'm looking at each and every one of you. Registration ends October the 11th. Notice that's a long time before November 8th, the election. I would hate for you to wake up October 15th and realize, oh, because at that point it's too late, right? So after that, all you'll hear is me talking about absentee ballots and early voting. So please, please, please don't wait. There's a nice table set up back there. Also, if you're looking for extra credit, that is also back there, so you know, kill two birds with one stone. And then, of course, there's a number of folks in the audience that are also like trained to be volunteers, so nudge your roommate, ask them to register to vote. Ask them to update their addresses. We can do it again. Don't you want to make a change here or anywhere? Wink, wink.
All right, thanks for that. And now I'm honored to introduce our speaker, Jen Miller. Jen Miller is the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. where she provides leadership to encourage and facilitate participation in the political process, provide nonpartisan educational materials for voters, and ensure free and fair elections, as well as working on a host of other issues. She's also a board member for the Ohio Debate Commission, the Ohio History Connection, and Kids Voting Ohio. Jen grew up in a small town in Ohio. She earned a bachelor's degree from Capital University and a master's degree in Arts, Policy, Education, and Administration from the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. And so I'm really happy to have Jen Miller here to talk. Her title of her talk is A Nonpartisan Defense of Democracy. So let's welcome.
Wow, it's so exciting to be here. I'm going to put this up here. Sorry if that's in someone's way. It's an honor for me to be here. I am a proud daughter of Ohio, and I went to Capital, which I think probably is somewhat similar to OWU in terms of just a small but mighty place to learn, and it really kind of set my heart and mind ablaze, and I just can keep going. I have a few announcements first, and then we're going to get going. I'll tell you what our agenda is. Our agenda is I'm going to give you a brief history of the League of Women Voters and voting rights, because really the suffrage movement and the League really are a story that intertwine. We're going to talk about gerrymandering and ballot access. We're going to talk about what you can do, and then we'll have time for questions. I am recovering from a brain injury, so you may see me use this. And I know that seems weird, but I'm not contagious or anything. It just helps my brain injury. I wanted to thank my dear friend Tanya, who drove me today because of my brain injury, so yay, Tanya. And I think the Delaware League, even though she lives in Columbus, is probably going to try to get her to join the Delaware League, as you should. And I think that's about all I have for now before we get started, but I wanted to know how many students, raise your hand if you're a student. I love that. Raise your hand if you're faculty. I love that. Raise your hand if you're a league member. I love that. By the way, students, what's your student rate for to be a member? Zero. So students, you can actually join the league for $0, and you should do that. Who's a proud voter? Yes. Who's a little bit worried about our democracy right now? Okay. Well, I am sometimes too, but I'm a lot more hopeful than I am worried, even though it does keep me up at night. So we're going to talk about all of this together. I just want to applaud Dr. Mack, because we did focus groups with young people, and we found, and we did these in 2018, we were going to do them again, and we had a pandemic. And what we found was that if you held everything equal, everything constant, it didn't matter socioeconomic status, educational status, employment status, race. We had about 25 students from age 17, because those were, about ready to vote, to 25. And what we learned was that if they didn't show up to vote, it was because they didn't have someone helping them through the hoops. And so the fact that this university has that level of stat, it's really inspiring. I can tell you that there's a lot of places in Ohio where we don't have a lot of turnout by students, and in fact, a lot of students are struggling to get through those hoops, including just things like where I get my mail is a different address and possibly a different voting precinct than where my dorm is, right? Even little things like that. There are schools across the state that are struggling to support their students or are failing to support their students in voting. So the fact that you all are on it so much is, you guys get a gold star for me. I'm very proud of you. And Dr. Mack, we might have to talk about how we can spread this to some other universities. So I can tell that if I were a student, I would like to have you as a professor. So it did go to sleep, my friend Elaine. I thought it would just wake up for us, but it's not. Is it there? Okay, great. It wanted me to sign in again, but all right, let's talk about the league. So these are just some pictures, but we do a lot of different kinds of stuff. So the League of Women Voters is local, state, and national. So students, when you join for free, you actually get to also automatically be a part of the Ohio League and the National League. So the local league here is working with, the boards of elections, working with schools, registering voters, recruiting poll workers, all those kinds of things. What I do is I really try to be the watchdog and voice for voters in the Ohio State House. So I'm dealing with the Secretary of State, with the state legislature, all those kinds of things. The National League has a strong presence on the Hill, again, to advocate for voters. Voters are our North Star. What that means for me is that it doesn't matter how you're going to vote. I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that you have access to the ballot, that it's reasonably easy, reasonably simple, it's fair, it's equitable in terms of the access, and that we can trust those results. That's our job at League. Voters are our North Star. I said something, and you heard nonpartisan defense of democracy. What do you think is the difference between nonpartisan and bipartisan? Students, it'll get really boring if you don't answer questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Bipartisan is when it is widely supported by both sides.
Okay, so bipartisan is when something is supported by both sides, or maybe you have both sides working on a project together or in the room together. So then what do you think nonpartisan is? Yeah.
It has nothing to do with sides. It's not an issue.
Yeah. So nothing to do with sides, it's about the issue itself. Yeah, so that's what we are. We don't endorse candidates, we don't endorse parties, we don't take money from political parties, we don't give money to political parties. Why? Because, again, voters are our North Star. Okay, all right, well, but League, again, we do lots of different things. We have events. We register voters, we do candidate forums, we lobby the State House and DC, we just have all kinds of fun together. So let me tell you a little bit about the League. We are actually we were formerly the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, and there was one point during women's suffrage that we had both the National and Ohio Women's Suffrage Associations based out of Ohio. So the first thing that we did at the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association was secure women the right to vote in school board races. That happened in the 1890s. This is kind of a mixed bag, because on one hand, yeah, we wanted women to be able to vote. On the other, the men of Ohio said, you have this sphere. You know about kids, so you can vote on this one thing. But then the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association also worked on ratification of the 19th Amendment, and that was really important, actually, because Ohio was one of the early states to ratify the 19th Amendment, and we'll talk about what that is here in a little bit in terms of what that really means. But we ended up being very key in the national conversation because at the time in 1920, both presidential candidates were from Ohio. So there was a lot of time spent by suffragists, and we are not suffragettes. We're suffragists. Suffragette is like those in England, and I blame Mary Poppins for us all calling it suffragettes. But we were suffragists here, and we were putting a lot of pressure on both of those presidential candidates that would then put pressure on their national parties. In 1920, the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association becomes the League of Women Voters at a convention in downtown Columbus. And we were formed by nurses, teachers, newspaper women, business women, the Council on Jewish Women, the DAR, the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, a wide range of folks. And we were, out the gate, one of the strongest state leagues in the country. So Belle Sherwin was a president, actually, of the National League. She was from Cleveland, as in Sherwin-Williams, the paint. She was the president in 1921 to 1924. We had other women who decided, instead of doing the nonpartisan route, actually working for the party. So we had several women from Ohio who ended up being leaders in actually the national RNC, because the RNC was the first to endorse suffrage. And then we had so many other things that just happened in Ohio. Ohio was a key place. This logo here, this colorful logo here, that was the image of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association. And I'm just going to keep going because we got so much to talk about. Suffrage timeline. Let's talk a little bit about this. The first thing, you only take one thing away, and I hope you take lots of things away, but one little piece of history is that the women's suffrage movement did not start at Seneca Falls. That's whitewashing. It started in the anti-slavery conventions decades before. And so, but here we go. We had the anti-slavery conventions where universal suffrage, universal rights were really the point of those conventions. Then we have Seneca Falls. We think, there's belief that Sojourner Truth gave her famous anti-woman speech at the Ohio Convention in 1851. There's some question about that, and I would love to hear Dr. Mack's opinion on that. We continue to have 1865 to 1869. This is where we really start to see some rights extended, right? This is where we end slavery and we grant rights to black men to vote. The American Equal Rights Association splits in 1869, and that's actually based on racial tensions, where one of the organizations was very pro rights of black men, even though women still were not going to get the right, and the other was not. And we see that kind of division, and I own that. I want us to own that, because what happened there with the introduction of these amendments, extending rights, voting, or at least prohibiting that voting be taken away from black men by any state, not really exactly extending, that divided the movement along racial lines. So we had a moment where women of all colors, black men, lots of folks coming together to work on those universal rights. And we're going to talk about that. The National Association of Colored Women's Club forms in 1896, and they immediately become a member of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association and therefore founder of the League. And then we start to see in the South that they come up with other ways to take voting away from black men, including the concept of a grandfather clause, which meant that if you were a descendant of a slave, you weren't allowed to vote. I wanted to just give a shout out to Delta Sigma Theta sorority, because they were their first act as a sorority for black women was to march in a suffrage parade, which, by the way, they were told not to, and they did anyway. We like that kind of tenacity. And then again, LWV forms across the US. Some black women, not many, unfortunately, were part of our leadership, and I'll just keep going here. But this is the point I wanted to make, and I'm making this, young people, for a reason, which is that, like, today, what I still see as an advocate, and I've been an advocate for a long time, is that the powers that be like to divide. They look at where we have fractures in our movement, and they use them to their benefit to slow down progress. So this is a way some folks dealt with it. Susan B. Anthony, she ain't having it, right? That does not mean that I think we should cancel her. Let's have conversations about Susan B. Anthony. But she's saying, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to work for the rights of black men. Even though Frederick Douglass is a really good friend of mine, even though I have been part of all these anti-slavery conversations, I'm not doing it. Lucy Stone, another white woman, says, if someone can get the right to vote, let's do that, right? And then you have Mary Church Terrell, who was educated at Oberlin. We have a lot of activity coming out of Oberlin at this time, is basically pointing to the fact that no one is really looking at this in an intersectional way. You all know the term intersectional. I think I didn't know it when I was in college until I started taking classes. But nobody's really looking at it from the perspective of being both a woman and a person of color. And all I want to say about this is this. all three of these individuals are human beings. Human beings that were navigating very difficult power dynamics, and those that wanted to keep the power, brilliantly divided this movement. And so, whatever it is you care about, whatever it is you want to work on, understand that the powers that be will want to divide you. And that's something that I encourage you to try to resist. Even if you disagree with people on strategy, even if you disagree with some on the way that they speak about things, keep in mind that divide and conquer, whether you're working in utility issues, which I was talking about earlier, or voting rights, that's what they like to do. All right, students rejected, see this in the bottom in red, all those states, what's in common? Southern states, states that were slave states, right? Here's what happened as this was getting adopted, as the 19th Amendment was getting passed. What happened was that it really started to change along racial lines, which is exactly why voting rights advocates always need to lean in on all the different intersections that someone might have. Finally passed in Tennessee. If someone ever tells you that their vote doesn't matter, the one thing you can always say is, well, they wouldn't work so hard to take it away from us, or wouldn't work so hard to not give it to us if it didn't matter. The other thing you could talk about is how one vote mattered here in Tennessee. Do you know why? Tell me why.
There was a man and he had a rose, I think.
Okay, that's pretty good. Keep going.
I know that it was his mother. I think it was a letter from his mother or something that like changed his mind. He was the deciding vote.
Yes, yes. Woo, you get a star. That's it. So it was getting ready to fail in Tennessee. We needed this state for ratification. It was getting ready to fail. And Harry T. Byrne was a no vote. And the rose piece was that if you were wearing a red rose, that meant you were not for the 19th Amendment passing. If you wore a yellow rose, that meant you were for it. So that's where the rose piece comes in, and that's pretty fun. But he gets a note from his mom saying, be a good boy and vote yes. And so he changes his vote. One legislator changes his vote for the 19th Amendment to get ratified to the Constitution. Good job. But the wording matters. This is why I didn't say what it was yet. Does this give women the right to vote? Kinda. Basically, it's saying you can't deny it based on someone's sex. That's not exactly the same, which is the same thing that happened with the 15th Amendment. Couldn't deny it based on race. But that means maybe you could find other creative ways to deny the vote, right? So here's the other thing. They weren't given the right to vote because women fought and died. You know, many of them, and maybe not in war, but they passed away before it actually was adopted, before this was ratified. Women were jailed. Women lost their children. Some women fought so hard that their husband didn't want anything to do with them, and at that time, you couldn't have custody of your children. We weren't given anything. But also not all women. So 1924 is when Native American women technically get the right to vote. However, it's not until 1962 where it's guaranteed in every state. Puerto Rican women don't get it until 1929, except if you can't read, it's not until 1935, and even just the reading tests are questioned there. If you keep going down, you just see that actually the way that we have dealt with democracy is slowly but surely bringing more and more and more people into the fold. How many people remember 18 becoming the new voting age? And I know this, guys, this is what was happening at that time. Students, folks were getting sent to war, getting sent to Vietnam. They were young enough to fight war and maybe die, but not old enough to elect their leaders. All the way down to disability access to today, which is why it takes all of us. I'm not going to talk too much about the Civil Rights Act, But I did want to just point out, over here on this side, that's the literacy test. I don't know how to pass that. So not only in the South were they doing poll taxes, which is ridiculous, but they were creating all these ridiculous hoops, like a literacy test, or tell us how many jelly beans are in a jar, but who knows how many jelly beans are in a jar? It has nothing to do with me knowing my interest in getting into the ballot box. Bloody Sunday. This is, folks in the South gathering, praying for voting rights. That was where the tide really turned on voting rights. I have this woman here, this is Barbara Jordan from Texas, and the reason why I have her there is because when the 15th Amendment passed and we had federal agents registering voters, making sure that black men could safely get to the polls, then Hayes, an Ohio president, pulls all that back. And we have a very long span of time where there are no black representatives from the South. So after the Civil Rights Act is passed, after we have a prohibition on poll taxes, Barbara becomes the first African American from Texas to be elected since Reconstruction, and one of 2 African Americans to be elected to Congress from the South after Reconstruction, so after the Jim Crow laws. And this is what I mean by nothing is ever given, and we just can't take it for granted. You know what, I'm gonna mention one more thing, though, as I think about it. Here's the other thing about the South at this time. So you have from basically right before 1900 through the 60s, where juries were pulled from the voting rolls. And you had only about 4% of African Americans enrolled to vote. So we also did not have jury by their peers. So there's always lots of other ways that these things connect. And it kind of, let's see if it goes, there we go. We're gonna talk about this again, but this is why we still protect voting today. And so I want you to make sure you know these numbers, and see they're in multiple languages. You can also text 866-OUR-VOTE, so that if something happens to you in the voting booth, even if you get it fixed, but it was not very, but there was a problem and you had to fight for your right, I want you to call that. Because I want you to know, do you know what I'm doing during early vote and on election day? I'm actually reading those tickets. We have volunteers, which by the way, leaguers, I need volunteers to answer the phones. But we have volunteers answering these phones, and they're entering it in, and we're reading these. And so for example, in 2020, at the end of the night on election day, 2 different counties, one rural, one urban, both denied someone who was COVID positive their right to vote right at the end of the night. But I'm reading the screen, and I immediately call the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State immediately calls those 2 boards of elections. And those boards of elections are instructed to call those voters to get them back. Just even those 2 votes. So this is why we want you to do this, because the other thing is not only do we deal in real time with what's going on, it helps us know ways that we need to better train poll workers or better educate voters if lots of folks are slipping through the cracks in a certain way. All right, I'm going to switch gears. We're going to go back to voting eventually, but we're going to talk redistricting and gerrymandering. What's gerrymandering? Picking your own voters, okay. How many have heard the term gerrymandering? Okay, well that's good, okay. It's not the easiest thing it's basically rigging districts so that your friends win. It's a human instinct, right? Like, let's just pretend we were a basketball team and we had a magical new technology for our shoes that would make us jump like a lot higher. We would want our team to have the magical technology and no other team to have it. That's kind of what this is when it comes to making legislative districts. We have to make them every 10 years because we have a new census. right? And people move, people die, people are born, and so the lines grow stale, and we remake these lines both for the State House, the State General Assembly, as well as Congress, okay? And fair districts is an effort of the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, ACLU, lots of friends, the Council of Churches, A. Philip Randolph Institute, NAACP, lots of friends are part of fair districts. And that's because what we're trying to do is fight gerrymandering. And why is that so bad? When you know you're going to win your election, that's what's done. We slice and dice districts, right? And we slice and dice them so that we pack a whole bunch of voters of one party into as few districts as possible, okay? When that happens, when someone knows they're going to win their election, they don't have to listen to us. And that creates dysfunctional government. So we get predictable election outcomes. Elected officials know they're going to win again. Voters are frustrated and disengaged. The primary becomes the most important because they know that whatever the party affiliation is for each district is who's going to win in the general. So that means that both parties play to their extremes, and that serves no one. So one thing I just want to say really clearly is here in Ohio, most recently, our maps have been rigged to favor Republican candidates, not Republican voters, not Republican voters, Republican candidates. Why do I say this? Because even if you are a Republican voter in the state of Ohio, where we have a supermajority of Republican lawmakers in Congress and a supermajority of Republican lawmakers in the State House, and your own lawmaker is Republican, they're still not listening to you. If they know that they're going to win their seat again, they don't have to listen to you. So instead they're playing to their big party donors, right? Instead they're playing to those extremes in that primary. And once that primary is over, they can feel sure that they're going to win. Now, sometimes you might have a swing seat. It's still the same way though. Something that we don't all understand necessarily is that, for example, in the State House, there's something called caucuses. So there's the Republican House Caucus, the Democratic House Caucus, the Republican Senate Caucus, the Democratic Senate Caucus. Well, those caucuses are worried about making sure that they keep their supermajority. So they could do some really controversial things, and maybe they lose a seat or so, but ultimately, one party remains in power. One thing I want to be really clear about in terms of the Ohio League, though, and the local league, is that we've been fighting gerrymandering in Ohio since the 1960s. And in the 1970s and 1980s was actually the Democrats rigging the maps. And we were fighting it then. And also, we've fought this in court, both in Ohio and nationally, and we fought it. Because again, who's our North Star? Voters, never a party. So when maps are rigged, voters are harmed, always. So we had something exciting happen, we hoped. When I say we've been fighting this since the 1970s, what I mean is every General Assembly we had a piece of legislation introduced after the 1967 law was changed in 1967 to change and rein in partisan gerrymandering. And we would get it introduced but not out of committee. We'd get it out of committee and onto the floor, but it wouldn't pass on one side. We'd get it on both sides. We'd actually get on the ballot, but we'd still lose at the ballot box. Voters just wouldn't do it. Finally, in 2015 and 2018, we were able to get some reforms passed here in Ohio that were endorsed by both political parties. The Ohio General Assembly, the Republicans and Democrats in the State House, as well as the League and Common Cause and academics, a whole bunch of people worked together to craft some reforms that were grand works of compromise. We never thought these were perfect at League, but we did think that they would go a long way because we thought that they would pass. Every time we had done this before, one party or the other fought us, opposed the reform. Both parties were guilty of opposing the reform at different parts of Ohio history. So we thought that they would pass because they were endorsed by both parties and they were these grand works of compromise. Over 70% of the vote, so Ohio votes about 54% Republican. Over 70% of the vote crafted these reforms. And they passed in all 88 counties. So what happened? This thing keeps popping up and looking at me funky. What happened is we put on our activism arm. We showed up to all of these hearings. We showed up all over the place with our shirts on. You see these ladies with these shirts? You could have a shirt like that too if you become a member of the League of Women Voters of Delaware County. We showed up. We packed hearing rooms. Let me tell you about this hearing room. Do you see this one up here? The far corner over there? The Ohio Redistricting Commission, and a lot of these folks actually were at these hearings or testified. The Ohio Redistricting Commission gave less than a week's notice that they were going to do hearings in August of 2021. They announced 10 hearings across the state. All of them were during the workday. A lot of times they were not in nice, easy places to park. And they expected no one to show. Did you hear Mandy back there? She said, ha. We packed every hearing room with everyday Ohioans talking about why they wanted to end gerrymandering and what it meant to them. We didn't give talking points. We actually trained folks how to talk about redistricting and their communities from their own perspective. We had that room there that you see is that full. That hearing went so late that the next hearing in the same day had to start late. We had standing room only. We went to a bigger room in Toledo, and it was packed. One place, people were sitting on the floor. We came out the gate trying to say to the map makers that even though they could rig maps, we didn't want them to, that the people of Ohio wanted fairness. We also had 15,000 yard signs. We sent about 50,000 postcards and emails. We did community mapping where you could say what you thought your community was, where you thought the line should be drawn. We had a mapping competition where everyday people, we had high school students, professors, pastors, everything in between, where they created their own congressional district map, what they thought that should be, what Ohio's 15 congressional districts should look like, as well as Ohio Senate and Ohio House. We had a picket to protest. At one point, the Ohio Redistricting Commission just wasn't meeting, and so we picketed outside each of their offices with the countdown of how many days it was. We had, this is the one where we're walking around the State House. That was called our Fair Maps Day, where we had folks from all over the state. We trained them on what we were doing, you know, the importance of redistricting. Most of them went and visited their lawmakers. And unfortunately, and I realize that I should have had a couple slides on the maps themselves. So what happened? The maps were rigged. They acted the same as they had always acted. They didn't work across the aisle. They didn't make districts that put voters first. They didn't even meet the deadlines. So League and ACLU and Friends sued in the Ohio Supreme Court. And this was the thing we could do. So before the 2015 and 2018 reforms were passed by voters, we couldn't go to the Ohio Supreme Court because we didn't have enough law in the Ohio Constitution. And then this is shocking, because over and over and over again, the Ohio Supreme Court struck these maps down as unconstitutional, violating those 2015 and 2018 reforms. And yet, they're still gerrymandered, but this is where we got. So when we started, we have, for the legislative maps on this side, let me just explain something called proportional fairness, which is that Ohio generally votes about 54% Republican. I say I'm about 54% extroverted. I also like to hang out by myself, about 54% Republican. But they had awarded, if an election had happened that day based on the election results of the past decade, they would have gotten the Republicans would have gotten 64% of the seats. So that's one of the many ways we measure if a map is fair. One is, are you slicing and dicing communities in really ridiculous ways? Are they really ridiculous shapes? Another is looking at something like proportional fairness. That doesn't mean that you're going to have exactly the number of seats would be 54%, because you can't, but about that, right? That it's basically the number of seats statewide is going to basically match the percentage of votes statewide in those races. And here's where we got. And so the maps we're voting on now, that we voted on in the primary and that will be in our November election, it looks like they're a lot more fair, and they are more fair. They are more fair. They are not as gerrymandered. The challenge is in that 45% Democrat, a whole bunch of those are these razor-thin margins. About 20 of those seats are these razor-thin margins that could actually go Republican. There are, even if it were, there was a whole bunch of Republican seats that were also razor-thin margins, but they're not. So that 54% is secure, right? The other side, the minority party, it's these razor-thin margins, which what that means is that we really need to make sure everybody votes. And that's why we want to be careful when we talk, the maps are gerrymandered, but I don't want people to think their votes don't count, because they really count. And the same thing happened for Congress, where originally they were going to give Democrats 2 seats, which certainly is nowhere near 45% of the vote total they would usually have. And we got it to something a little bit closer, which is 2 Democratic seats and 2 toss-ups that lean Democratic. Getting there. So what does this mean? This means multiple things. The first is we need to make sure that everybody knows that the lines have changed and they know what district they're in so they can research their candidates. We need to make sure everyone shows up to vote. And both of these court cases are still going before the Ohio Supreme Court. So my organization, the ACLU, and others are still going to be dealing with the Ohio Supreme Court after the election, okay? So we could get new maps as early as 2024, okay? So there's a lot going on there. So we're going to make sure people vote right now. That's our short term. Our medium is that we're going to deal with the courts, and our long term is we're going to have to go back to the ballot box, I think. We're going to have to really change the Constitution so that these folks just can't do what they've been doing. And we can talk about that later if you want. But I wanted to just mention questions about redistricting first. Yep, Mindy. There are three Supreme Court justices on the ballot, and the Ohio Supreme Court is going to be really key for our medium-term strategy of continuing our work in the Ohio Supreme Court and showing that the maps are still unduly favoring one party, candidates of one party, not voters of one party. The long term is probably, so one of the things we're doing right now, and I should have had a slide in this, and I'm sorry I didn't, but we're looking at how redistricting has gone across the country. And there's a lot of places where their rules for mapping are similar to ours. They have something similar about not gerrymandering, not unduly favoring one party. They have similar rules, and their maps are more fair, and it's all about who made the maps. There are 3 things in those states that are usually the case. 1, it's not sitting elected officials, because it's pretty hard if you're running for office to not think about your advantage and the advantage of your friends. 2, it's balanced, so you have about the same number of Republicans and Democrats, or Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And 3rd, it's insulated, which means that the governor nor the General Assembly can get rid of the maps that are created. So an independent commission of everyday people. So maybe we would have an academic from OWU, and we would have a League of Women Voters representative, and we would have a representative maybe from the NAACP, things like that. An independent group that is generally the same number of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And then the maps that are created cannot be monkeyed with by the governor or the General Assembly. We have a few more things I'm worried about for democracy. First is mis and disinformation. What's the difference, guys, between mis and disinformation? Dis is on purpose. Mis just means people are confused. So an example of misinformation can be a lot of people think that, well, okay, here's one. Here's a student one. I was going to say a different one, but I'm going to do this one. That if you live out of town, if you live out of state, that you have to vote out of state. Like if your family, your original address is out of state, that you have to vote out of state. Or if you register in Ohio, that somehow you would lose some sort of benefits for aid or things like that. That's misinformation. Disinformation is when people are purposefully confusing you to sow distrust or confusion. So a good case of disinformation was the 12th Congressional District had a special election where this was a few years ago, that district was really rigged to go Republican, but there was so much passion by the volunteers, and there was only one seat up for grabs, this 1/12th district, that the Democratic candidate was looking closer than had ever been for that district. And someone started sending texts to voters on the Ohio State campus telling them of a wrong polling location. So this is the difference between the two. Both are insidious. And one of the things that all of you can do is if you see something that you think is wrong, flag it. Flag it for me, flag it for your professors so that we can deal with it. Both are insidious, but disinformation is really designed to suppress the vote, not through these rules like we had back in the day with a literacy test that makes no sense, but instead by telling you the wrong information. The joke is always that someone will say the Republicans vote on election day and they'll say the Democrats vote the day after. That would be an example of disinformation, but it's much more sophisticated than that. A common misunderstanding here in Ohio is that if you have a criminal record that you can't vote. This can be both mis and disinformation. It can be mis in that lots of people just think that's the way it is, when in fact, the only folks who can't vote are those who are currently serving time for a felony. If you're waiting a trial, if you've already served your time, you're on probation, if you only have a misdemeanor, any of those things you can vote. You just got to make sure that your registration is up to date, okay? But so it's mis because people are confused by that. It's dis because a lot of times lower income communities will get flyered, can't figure out who it is, get flyered, all their cars will get flyered saying that they can't vote. And when that happens, what I'm saying to you guys is, I need you to tell me. Because I'll be on it right away, and I'll get the Secretary of State on it, and I'll get the Board of Elections on it, and we'll get our volunteers to go knock on those doors and make sure that they know their rights, okay? So all of you can do that one thing, just be the cyber detectives. See if it's good information or not, okay? We, of course, have barriers to the ballot, especially for seniors, students, people with disabilities, new Americans, active duty military. There's a lot of barriers to the ballot. And so that's something that we deal with two ways. One is through education, just trying to help voters understand their rights and all the logistics of voting. And two, by trying to change policies, whether that's in a courtroom, which we've had to do, or it's going to the State House or the Secretary of State and trying to get something changed. Which brings me to the last. We have proposed bills in the Ohio State House that would gut access. So it would be very, very, very strict ID. So you'd have to have an Ohio-issued ID that would have to have your right address on there. So even if you just moved, it's an unexpired ID, but you just moved, Wouldn't count. You'd have to bring another form of identification. There's a proposal to reduce early voting. Right now we have 28 days of early voting to 7 days. Very, very extreme things that are being proposed in the Ohio State House that I think could move this fall after the election. So one of the things you can do is make sure you're on the league's email address, you're following us on social media, because we might need you all to be calling and asking for these things not to happen. And this funky window keeps popping up. All right, here's election protection. Election protection is one of my most favorite things in all the world. In fact, the first thing I did in election space, I was in 2004, and I volunteered to be a poll monitor for election protection, which is nonpartisan. And where I was in 2004, there were places in central Ohio that barely had any lines at all because the Board of Elections did a good job planning and had enough workers and had enough machines and all that. And then there were places in Ohio where the lines got as long as 6 or 7 hours. And those were in communities of color and low-income communities. I was at a polling location, at one of those locations that had very long hours. And in fact, one of the things that was happening is that you had to go down these very steep steps to get to your voting machine. And people were going down these steep steps, and then it was confusing as to where you were supposed to go, because there was multiple precincts. So if you were in this part of OWU, you would be in this line. If you were in this part of Delaware, you'd be in this line. So you had to magically know which line you were supposed to be in. And sometimes people would go to the wrong spot, and they would be told to go all the way back to the end of the line. There was a whole bunch of things like this. There are also, people with disabilities did not know that they didn't have to take the steps. They did not mark that there was another entrance for people with mobility challenges. All of these different things were happening. I was just a volunteer that got trained in an hour training, and then all of this is terrible. So I'm calling, and we're getting lawyers there. It ended up being part of the League of Women Voters of Ohio lawsuit that secured better disability access as well as election administration planning. What we argued was they failed to actually understand what turnout was going to be and plan appropriately for every polling location. So now, and my league members know this because I tell them to look for the election administration plan, this is where the Board of Elections says, this is what we think turnout's going to be, and this is how we're going to allocate resources. And here, and they put in all kinds of stuff about like if the weather is bad or if the electric goes out, all of that. That was secured for the first time through a lawsuit, as was post-election audits. So when I said to you, and I showed you that phone number, hi, why aren't you going? There we go. The 866-hour vote phone number, and I said, anything I want you to call, even if you're able to fix it yourself, it's because it matters. We actually do reports for lawmakers and the Secretary of State on the calls we get, right? We do all kinds of different things. And here are all the organizations that are a part of that. You can be an ambassador, which is basically an educator. You can get signs all over the place and materials at different locations and coffee shops and things like that. A poll monitor is what I was doing, which is where I was wearing a You Have the Right to Vote shirt, and people just started coming up to me, telling me all the crazy things that they were experiencing when they were in the line. You can be a social media monitor, which those are the folks who are really looking, again, for that mis and disinformation, so we can take care of that. We have text banking, where you can volunteer to text folks and remind them as to when the election is and how to find the early vote center, and that becomes even more important if we get really bad information. We might focus a lot of energy in one location. Command center volunteer, that would be for my more pros. I do need those. And peacekeeper, this is for, if you know social workers or clergy members or others who have de-escalation training. We actually made the New York Times for this in 2020 because we had something called a peacekeeper, and that was because there was so much tension around the polls, so much stress. And what boards of elections can do when someone, let's just say someone just starts carrying a gun, you know, very close to the polling location, that's going to make everyone stressed out, right? Or there were moments when the drop boxes were blocked by supporters of one party or one candidate, right? When these things happen, boards of elections call law enforcement, which is completely reasonable, but not all voters are comfortable with law enforcement. So what we did was we brought in clergy in their garb, social workers, to help bring that temperature down. And we got a lot of compliments from boards of elections about it. We made the New York Times, so we need those kinds of folks. What else can you do? You can do so much. Let's go. You can be a poll worker. So, poll workers are superheroes. Everything you do, from checking in to being escorted to your machine, to showing you how to cast your ballot, to getting your sticker afterwards, is done by people just like you and me. We need poll workers. We need poll workers who are young. We need poll workers who are multilingual. Be a poll worker. See if you can get the day off school, and you get paid too, and you get a front line to democracy. You get a front seat to democracy. A few resources. VoteOhio.gov is the Secretary of State, that's where you would check your registration. Keep in mind that lots of people forget to update their registration, and that causes a lot of problems, including if you forget to update your registration and you haven't voted for a while, you could get removed from the rolls, so make sure you do that. This is our nonpartisan voter guide, vote411.org. If you're just interested in suffrage, we did do an intersectional reading guide on suffrage that goes from baby board books all the way to the heavy duty stuff. And so we have information on that that's super fun. You can become a member, free for students. Did we mention that yet? You can join us for State House Day. Oh my goodness, this also, we will give scholarships to students for this too, because we charge, because we feed people, and we have to rent a room. But our State House Day this year is going to be December 7th, and it will be downtown. Why? Because you're going to get trained on stuff. Like if one of those bad bills, like about, you know, that's going to cut early voting or something, if that gets introduced, we're going to need people from all over Ohio going and talking to lawmakers about why that's not okay. So you can join us for that. You can give us money if you have some of that. Key dates, voter registration deadline, which is also the deadline to update your registration, is the 11th. Absentee ballots are set out on the 12th, as is early voting starts. And remember, there's only one early voting location, right? Or you can go on election day to your polling location. And so let's talk questions. What questions, what comments you got for me?
Okay, I have a microphone. If you have a question. Somebody get us started.
Yes. Oh, yeah, we could have a whole bunch of those. You know, those redistricting meetings were so bittersweet because on one hand, I was never in that room alone. I made it to almost every hearing, and there were always league people and voters there just to be there to advocate for fairness and democracy, and that was beautiful. But at the same time, we weren't being heard. And so there were a lot of examples of that. There were examples where at the very end, when they were deciding what maps they were going to do, and it didn't matter what we said, they weren't allowing testimony, and one of the redistricting commissioners actually quoted my testimony to justify gerrymandering. But I wasn't allowed to correct the record. So, guys, this is when I finally joined Twitter, just so you know, because I was like, this is not okay. So that was an ironic moment. There were moments when, again, over and over and over again, the Ohio Supreme Court justices that are Republican and Democrat siding with voters, siding with the Ohio Constitution, striking down these maps, including the ones we're on, and they're just continuing to go forward. There was one where, and this was at the very end, we were so well behaved, right? We were so well behaved this whole time. We were respectful, we were quiet, we wore our shirts so everyone knew what we stood for, but we followed all the rules. But then at the very end, they were voting out again a bad map. And we started yelling, "Hold them in contempt. Hold them in contempt. Hold them in contempt." Well, and they had to shut the, I don't really believe in calling people names, but they actually had to adjourn the meeting for a while. And so those were a couple moments. But I think the most magical was just, again, grassroots organizations, usually when they have someone show up to testify for something, they give you a whole bunch of talking points. And that's not how we did it, right? We taught thousands of Ohioans how to find where they were on the map, how to talk about why that didn't seem right to them. Why would you split OWU down the middle? Things like that are happening all the time, right? Like there are examples where one house is literally one district on this side and another district on 3 other sides. All of that is because they're using big data and amazing software to go down voter by voter to draw these districts in a way that protect them and their friends, right? But I didn't have to do that analysis for all the folks showing up. They knew how to do it. Those things were really, really exciting. Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, Hallie.
You mentioned that we're coming up on a lame duck session here, and I'm wondering if you think there's really anything we can do about that. And then also, I'm wondering if you have an opinion about the fact that our judges will now have a partisan flag after their names.
Good. So lame duck is when it's the very end of a legislature. So the Ohio State House, those state lawmakers, every 2 years, it's technically a new legislature. So we'll have a whole bunch of outgoing folks. Here's one of the challenges with Ohio, is that we have a year-round legislature. So they decide when they want to not be in session or when they do. Like there are places where the state legislature is only in for 4 months a year. I think New Mexico still has like every other year. Is it New Mexico or Nevada? It's New Mexico or Nevada that has every other year that they're in session, which sounds amazing to me. So what happens is thousands of bills get introduced over this time frame that could be good things about better protecting, survivors of domestic violence or better providing school funding. And then there can be a whole bunch of bad things in there about voting or healthcare or all these things. And so they're all just sitting there in the hopper, okay? So we have the election and then they come back and there's very little time left. And so they call it lame duck, but that's not what it feels like. It feels like just legislation flying at your face, to be honest, because so many things are moving. It's full of committee hearings, so many different things going on. That's why we're decided to have ours on December 7th this year. It's usually in the spring, is so that we can bring folks in. I have absolutely seen and have absolutely had victories in lame duck. So an example is a couple years ago, they had introduced a bill to make it harder for everyday people like us to get something on the ballot. So right now, today, and a lot of these folks collected signatures to get issues on the ballot, like the redistricting reform. But it could be lots of other things. It could be community policing, whatever it is. And they were going to make it almost impossible for us to do that. They thought it was going to go really fast. So they introduced this piece of legislation on a Wednesday. By Friday, we were collecting organizational signatures and had over 100 organizations standing with us against that piece of legislation. And then by Tuesday, for their first hearing, we had filled the room with everyday folks saying, don't take away our ability for direct democracy. There's two kinds, right? There's the representative democracy, where we vote for people to basically do the governing and making the laws. And then there's direct democracy, where we take it in our own hands. And we were able to defeat that. So they thought it was going to pass, and they only had 2 hearings, and that second hearing just got shut down. So yes, it's a lot easier to defeat bad things than get good things, but I have seen good things go through lame duck too. So yes, you should always be calling your lawmakers about whatever it is that matters to you. Oh, no, well, lame duck, it'll still be the same supermajority. So, because that doesn't change until January. And then, okay, so now for the first time ever, for Supreme Court, you'll have a Republican or a Democrat, they will be named. Part of their party affiliation will be named along with their name on the ballot. This has never happened before. In Ohio, the league firmly opposes that because it's not a judge doesn't make laws. That's what lawmakers do. And lawmakers have party platforms and all those things in terms of how they stand on different things. A judge is supposed to leave their party proclivities at the door and judge cases on the merit. Supposed to. And we are concerned that the fact that we will have on the Supreme Court, they'll be delineated Republican or Democrat, that it'll do a couple things. One is we're afraid that voters will think that guarantees a certain way that a judge is going to vote, which it might not. Like, for example, if an abortion case comes up, that doesn't mean that someone's guaranteed to vote a certain way because of their party, but also that it will force them to play more to the party, that it actually will politicize the issue more. So we're firmly against that. But it is what it is. We fought it. It passed. So, students, can you tell me something maybe that you learned or something that resonated with you? If you don't have a question, I would love that. Remember, it's boring if you don't talk.
I appreciated your part about, I guess, the election administration piece. I've worked a lot of election days, and I think in one hand it's kind of very cool to see kind of democracy at work, all these ordinary people running elections, but at the same time it's a bit terrifying. I think I've had a few experiences where I think I was 18. It was my second time working an election, and the person in charge of it was at my location I was working at, was asking me questions. Mm-hmm. And they said, okay, that's not comforting. So I guess, and I don't really think there's a great answer to this, it's besides getting people, encouraging people to become poll workers and people becoming, poll worker veterans, I guess, is there a more sustainable way to better train poll workers? I feel like the training what I've received isn't always great. You get a lot thrown at you in 1 hour. I've seen times where someone's not sure of something, especially with OU students, they're not sure if the utility bill is a proper identification, so they turn them away, which, you'd hope somebody's there to stop that and move that up the chain. But I guess, I don't exactly know what I'm asking, but, do you think that there's a more sustainable way to better train poll workers? Because I feel like
Yeah, so what she's basically saying, and keep this in mind, that these are folks, poll workers are everyday superheroes like you and me who get trained, but they do this once a year, right? Or twice a year, or maybe have never done it before. And so that can be really complicated. So we spend a lot of time thinking about poll worker training. And so, for example, and we do a lot of communication with boards of elections about how they train and what they train on. So, for example, someone with a cognitive disability is allowed to vote unless a court says that they are incompetent specifically for voting. But one of the things we were getting a lot on our call hotline, our 866-R vote, was that poll workers were questioning if someone who came in with a cognitive ability could vote. And so what we did, and now we do this every election cycle, is we partnered the voting rights groups, or the voter advocate groups, partnered with the disability advocate groups, and we send a letter to all 88 boards of elections making sure that they include that information in their poll worker training. We have a lot of examples of that. Also, we have boards of elections teams across the state who actually meet with boards of elections, and there's always questions there about training. Those boards of elections teams might actually remember some things that well-intended poll workers just didn't have right. We talk about that. Another common one is voter check-in. That's a place where people can fall through the cracks. And so there's a lot there. We meet with the Secretary of State year-round about this. We talk to boards of elections year-round about this. We work on all those kinds of things. The other thing is actually League has a YouTube channel. League of Women Voters of Ohio has a YouTube channel. And we not only do a whole bunch of trainings ourselves on just the unique needs of diverse voters, but we make that available. So if you want to be a poll worker and you're a little worried about it, you could do that, right? And we'll give you the best practices for serving someone who is a college student. You know, the considerations for someone who's housing insecure, since voting is always tied to an address and someone might not have a secure address. So those would be the couple things I would say. But again, it's really important that y'all are making calls when things aren't working right, because a lot of times we'll see a theme. And that's what I do. I don't answer the phone. I'm looking for the themes. And I might see, and often see, that at one location in one county, we keep having this trouble with X, Y, Z. Then I'll call the Board of Elections and just say, hey, know you all are working hard? I think someone needs a reiteration on some rules here. And then that usually gets taken care of. I want to ask another student, Mindy. Yeah. That's awesome. And yes, please be nice to your Board of Elections, because you know what? They had to work really hard this year because they had 2 primaries, not one. It's going to be a major election with lots of folks. They just came through a pandemic that was hard. And they're often the brunt of those lies about election fraud. So be nice to your boards of elections. We don't always agree with boards of elections, but we have a good relationship with them because we know how to be diplomatic about the things that we'd like to see be different. Yeah.
So are the things that you do voluntarily, or is it a part of your profession?
What I do?
Yes.
Yeah, this is way more than a full-time job.
But also the other things that you do that aren't really a part of your profession, I found that very interesting because you're taking time to consider your state and the people in your state versus just sticking to your profession.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Well, here's the thing I will say is it's a way full-time job for me, but there's a lot of people in this room who are League members, and it's kind of a full-time job for them too. Like, League is powered by volunteers and members. And so the one thing I would say to all of you is that if you want real-world experience, League, because it is so designed for volunteers, you will get that. You know, if you volunteer for League, yeah, maybe occasionally it's stuffing envelopes, but a lot of times it's going to be even bigger and better and other stuff that you can do. So we want that. By the way, also, we do have paid internships for women of Central Ohio, because that's what the funder wanted. But I also can absolutely invite interns who are non-binary, whatever. If you're interested in getting that kind of experience, you should let me know. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you do not have to be a woman to belong to the League of Women Voters. And in fact, my Ohio board has 2 men on it. We welcome everyone at the League and always have. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about your presentation. Earlier, you said that like Sojourner Truth might have not given a speech, but I guess I'm confused about that because my understanding is that she did give the speech. It's just that the popular transcript of the speech that we know today, the Ain't I a Woman, was written way after the speech
Right.
By someone who wasn't there
Yep.
and
So-
gave a false accent.
Yeah, so what I was saying is there's the question is, did she give that exact speech in Akron on that date? And some say yes and some say no. And some believe it so much that they're building a monument for her in the Akron area, which I think is great. But I just wanted to point out that she absolutely was a suffragist and absolutely a powerful speaker. The question is on that date, if she gave that exact speech.
If I can ask, what's the specific reform you would recommend to the Ohio Redistricting Commission to make it work
Yep.
better?
Yep, so that's, again, it would be, let's have different people make it. And let's have it be non-politicians. The Redistricting Commission right now is 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And that's because the way Ohio votes for governor, the race, the party that wins the governor's race usually wins the other statewide. So there's 3 statewide on there. And so it would be generally balanced of non-politicians and would be insulated so that the governor or the legislature couldn't basically veto or abandon the fair map. But it would keep a lot of the other things. Maybe we would also strengthen the power of the Supreme Court. But one of the things we need to do is we need to watch and see what happens at the U.S. Supreme Court with some cases before we go out collecting signatures. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So she's asking about the U.S. Supreme Court. There is a redistricting case. Now, this is so ironic, right? So the League of Ohio, the Ohio League, and our friends at ACLU and others brought a case in 2018, actually against our congressional districts, and we won. We had a 3-judge federal panel of Republicans and Democrats who said that yes, every one of our congressional districts was a partisan gerrymander and therefore unconstitutional. The state appealed, which would have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the U.S. Supreme Court punted and said that that this was not judiciable, that it wasn't basically wasn't their job, or they didn't have the authority to deal with redistricting cases. Now we fast forward, and there's another case that is coming before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's from North Carolina, where the North Carolina Supreme Court struck down maps, and the state said that the North Carolina Supreme Court had no authority to do so, and the U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear it. So it's kind of like whiplash, right? Like U.S. Supreme Court, do you or don't you have the authority? Is this in your purview? So that's question 1. But what they're talking about is this very arcane fringe theory called the independent state legislature theory. Some people call it clause, but it's really a theory. And it's something that has been really on the fringes. It kind of was around in 2004 with Bush v. Gore. And it's a reading of the U.S. election code that says that only state legislatures, the way they read it is that only state legislatures can determine the time, place, and manner of federal elections. Okay, that would be extreme. If the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that way, with that very narrow reading, that would also mean that, let's say that Ohio just started turning away individuals who have a developmental or cognitive challenge willy-nilly we wouldn't be able to sue on that, right? It would mean a whole bunch of cases. Like, it would take away the judiciary's ability to really deal with any aspect of voting rights if they did that. But they could just narrowly also rule in a way that strikes down North Carolina but doesn't take others down with it. How that works for us is this, is we have people, including the redistricting commissioners, arguing that the independent state legislature theory should apply here and that the Ohio Supreme Court didn't have any authority. Here's where that's completely wrong. The Ohio General Assembly, so therefore the state legislature, gave the Ohio Supreme Court authority when they created these reforms in 2015 and 2018. The state legislature exercised its authority by naming the Ohio Supreme Court the judicial body to hear cases if there are questions about it. But we're going to still have to see. And that's what we are waiting for before you really see us with our clipboards. We're waiting to see how that plays out so that we can design the language appropriately. What we don't want to do is start doing this now. And then the way the US Supreme Court rules would mean all that effort was in vain and that we have to actually do different language. I mean, the Supreme Court is a little bit of a, you know, they get to decide when they're going to hear that, so. Yes, the state Supreme Court, yeah, yeah, I don't want to go into that too much, but yeah, there was an attempt. So yes, the state Supreme Court struck down these maps every single time, including the maps that voters are voting on now. But I don't want to talk too much about that right now because that makes people think that their votes don't count. And so we have to kind of do two things at once, which is get people to vote because their votes do matter. And actually, votes for the General Assembly and Congress could have more weight. The maps are not as rigged as they were last decade. They're just not good enough yet. And yeah, there was an attempt to take it to federal court instead, and that's a whole nother story that I don't feel like these guys need, and we're supposed to close this hall at 8:30. But I'll just say this, there's been a lot of monkeying around, and judges matter. So don't skip your judicial races.
Yeah, we're about out of time, but let's thank Jen Miller again.
And one more thing, I'm sorry. Democracy works if you work it. So please do your part. If you're really passionate about a party, go work for the party. If you really want to be nonpartisan, work with the league or be a poll worker. But even if all you do is just check and make sure that all your friends have a voting plan, you are part of the solution. So thank you.